Okay, so I think we should make a start. So a very big welcome to all of you today, this lunchtime, as we commence the first of 3 sessions on leadership. And it's a great pleasure to have Major General, who's now retired, Tim Cross CBE, to lead us for these 3 sessions, using his own experiences from over 40 years in the British Army before he retired in 2007, and 40 years as a Christian, 25 of them as a lay minister and itinerant preacher and speaker. For those of you who don't know anything about Christians in government, it's both the Cross Government Christian Network and a network of networks. The Departmental Christian Network sitting under its umbrella. The Christians in Government mission is to connect, and once we're connected, we can equip and inspire a Christian perspective. That is, inspire rather than force a Christian perspective. As this is a Christians in Government event, I'll say a quick prayer before I hand over to Tim. So Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can meet together this lunchtime to look at leadership and what it's about. I ask for your blessing over us, for your blessing over Tim, for blessing over everyone else, that the IT would work and that each of us would go away with something really useful. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, just a couple of last things, in fact, 3 last things. Firstly, grateful if you could keep yourself on mute. Secondly, to save bandwidth, please switch off your video, apart from Tim. And thirdly, after Tim has spoken, there will be time for questions. Please put any questions on Slido rather than in the chat. I'll paste the Slido link in the chat. Okay, over to you, Tim. Oh, you're on mute, Tim. Tim, you're on mute.
Is that better?
Yes, that's great.
Okay. I think you must probably just put me on mute when you did everybody else. Yeah, so it's great to be with you. I've done a few of these online. It's not perfect. Obviously, I'd far rather be alongside you all. And I've written a script, which I'm going to try and stick to. And alongside that is a bunch of slides that Aidan has got charge of. So you'll find me saying continuously, next slide, please, as we move through that. And I hope everybody can see the slides, and I hope you can all hear me. So I've got a mission today. Aidan's given me this mission of speaking to you over 3 sessions on this issue of leadership. And today I want to look at leadership in the round, about what Christian leadership particularly looks like in today's secular world. So that's my mission. If I may be so bold, you've got yours. And yours is to simply listen to what I have to say and then give me a hard time in questions. Although, of course, because we're online, you can simply switch off if you decide you finish your mission before I finish mine. And I need to manage your expectations. If we can put up the next slide, Aidan, by managing or by sharing with you the fact that there were something like 2,000 books published on leadership in the year 2000. It's one of those statistics that chimes nicely. But this guy Burns said that leadership is one of the most observed and least understood phenomenon on Earth. So in my 40 minutes or so today, I'm not sure I'm going to make that much of a difference to the corpus of knowledge on leadership, but hopefully we'll make a start. And I have to say too that particularly if H.G. Wells is correct, then I'm going to struggle too, because in the next slide, Aidan, you'll see this quote from him, which is one of my favorite quotes, that the professional military mind is by necessity an inferior and unimaginative mind. No man, he said, of high intellectual ability would willingly imprison their gifts in such a calling. Well, that's me. But I should add that H.G. Wells is reputed to have met Stalin once and apparently left thinking that Stalin was a nice bloke. So maybe I don't have to worry too much. Now, that all said, please remember, I'm not talking today of military leadership specifically. Obviously, that's my background. That's the baggage I carry. But leadership as a whole. And on this next slide, the reasons for that. that leadership is a central plank in every walk of life. It's through leadership we raise our families, run our social, our sporting events, win our commercial as well as our military battles. And obviously, we need leaders everywhere. We need them in industry, in commerce, in government, where you guys are operating, in education, and I would say especially today in the church. And that leadership needs to be good leadership. And this next slide just sort of sets a bit of a scene for that. That by good leadership, I mean leadership that sets the culture, that unlocks the potential in others by challenging and changing the constraints that we so often work under, the conditions, by breaking the inevitable drift to entropy as the people we lead inevitably seek self, safety, comfort, and so on. We need to break that. We need to set a new culture. We need to set the structure of our organization as leaders. What structure always follows strategy. Having decided what that strategic intent looks like, we decide who's in the team, how are we going to organize them, what processes will or will not apply. And we then set the conditions. One in particular that I feel particularly strongly about is that we as leaders, we should struggle to hold fewer meetings. We should empower people through what the military call mission command, telling people what needs to be done and then leaving them to get on with it, not having long screwdrivers probing all the time and calling people back and so on. And the bane of everybody's life is meetings. And as leaders, we can take the lead in reducing those numbers by allowing people the freedom to get on. Overall, it's about making people feel good, creating the space for them to thrive, to soar, and ultimately too about leaving the world in a better place. We haven't got time to go into it now, but often people will say somebody like Hitler was a great leader. Well, I don't think so. He didn't leave the world in a better place. That's what we as good leaders should be attempting to do. So on this next slide, I just want to make the point that leadership in my view, is very different to management. We talk about management a lot. And if I had my way, I would stop using the word quite often when we talk about management boards and those sort of things. Management is largely, I would offer, about stability, about stuff, about numbers. And essentially, managers use material and financial resources to achieve roughly, relatively short-term tactical objectives. They display a range of known and well-understood techniques and skills, and they produce results within known constraints and conditions, and tend to focus on metrics and establish benchmarks. Now, managing resources like time and space, equipment and money well is, of course, extremely important. But those things are finite. They're measurable by definition, and they're finite. Whilst the main resource we have, people, can't be managed like commodities or money. They need to be led so that their infinite potential can be realized. Organizations are only as effective as the leadership enables them to be. And leaders and led have a unique relationship. That relationship, or those relationships, are infinitely variable. And the reality is that good managers don't necessarily make good leaders. And good leaders aren't necessarily good managers. Indeed, in my experience, they often aren't. Because management, whilst it deals with stability and stuff and numbers, leadership deals with people, with uncertainty and turbulence. And those leaders do that through bringing calm reassurance. On the next slide, you'll see some of these things listed. Calm reassurance, inspiring those they are leading and giving them clear direction. Driving on in the face of hardship and opposition. And there will always be hardship and opposition for us as leaders. And leaders fundamentally shape mindsets. They discover new ways of doing things, of mapping out longer term strategies. They establish a cultural architecture, building a different environment in which people have the confidence and the security to innovate and prosper. And crucially, I think, in doing all of that, leaders answer these sorts of questions. Where are we going? Why are we going there? Why is it better when we get there? And how are we going to get there? Really important questions for most of us in whatever position we are in any organization. So the next slide's a blank. Well, I just talked through a couple of things. There are many definitions of leadership around, and you'll have heard, I'm sure, many of them. The simplest is that leadership is influence, which I like because it confirms that everyone is a leader. It's not about whether or not I'm a leader, that I've been born as a leader or I can be made as a leader. The bottom line is we all influence others around us. And therefore, by definition, we are all leaders. The question is, how well are we going to do that? And whether or not that influence is for good or for ill. Put most simply, good leaders make a positive difference. As I said earlier, not leading people into disaster, but leaving the world a better place. But that leadership and such leadership isn't easy. Driving on in the face of the inevitable hardship and opposition is tough and draining, even at the best of times. And when times are difficult, it can be a very lonely place to be. In his book, Defeat into Victory, describing his experiences during the initial retreat in the Far East, Field Marshal Bill Slim put it like this on the next slide, Aidan, if you would. They stood there silent and looked at me. All commanders know that look. They see it in the eyes of their staff and their men when things are really bad, when the toughest soldiers want holding up, and when they turn where they should turn for support to their commander. And sometimes he or she does not know what to say. They feel very much alone. And I've certainly been in positions like that. But it leads me to my preferred definition, which is on the next slide, that leadership is about winning the hearts and minds of people in order to achieve a common purpose. Winning hearts and minds in order to achieve a common purpose. Now, that common purpose may be winning a military campaign or a football match or improving market share or drawing more people to Christ. Whatever it is, that purpose must be clearly understood. In the military, we call it a mission. You may call it something else, perhaps a target. But either way, we need to be clear about what it is that we're about and establish a desire within our team to achieve it. Winning hearts, which is what the next slide talks about, is all about that desire and about gaining trust and respect and confidence in you as a leader, making people feel wanted, listened to, respected, and needed, making them feel that they're involved, not just participating. There's a very old joke that talks about the farmer whose birthday it is, and the animals get together and make him a birthday present, and they decide to make him breakfast. The chicken participates in the bacon and eggs. The pig gets involved. He has to give a part of his anatomy to produce the bacon. We want people to be involved, not just participating. And we want to give them pride in themselves, pride in their job, pride in their organization. Winning hearts involves words like pride and integrity and courage, words which I'm going to return to. Now, winning minds, on the other hand, which is on the next slide, Aidan, is all about giving clarity of direction, clarity about expectations, and clarity about goals, establishing firm and distinct boundaries within which people can operate, and getting clarity for that gives them the confidence of what it is they can and cannot do. So, the next slide's a blank, Aidan. So this all said, what does this look like in practice? And I just want to give a couple of examples of that before going on to establish some of the Christian principles that I want to get into. For most of us, on the next slide, Aidan, for most of us, our day-to-day work involves what most people call tame problems. Now, whilst these can be complex, they're usually things that management has previously solved, and there's a well-established procedure for solving them. So heart surgery, for example, is complex, obviously, but when they wheel us into the operating theatre, none of us, I'm sure, want to hear the surgeon ask his or her team, what do we do now? The surgeon's job is to get the team to engage in the appropriate processes in order to solve the problem. It's a tame problem because they've done this many times before. And in doing it, they've managed to put together the processes, the procedures of how to deal with what needs to be dealt with. On the other hand, next slide, Aidan, we talk about wicked problems. Wicked problems are different. They're novel. They're intransigent sometimes, often embedded in other problems. And to solve them, we have to construct a solution by securing collective consent. It's a collaborative, not an authoritarian process. And in doing that, it often results in having to learn without a perfect or unique solution. Often the solution we come up with produces other problems that flow from it. Now, these are problems for leadership. They're different in just releasing people to do processes and procedures they've done before, because we haven't faced this sort of problem before. So these are problems for leadership, not management. And crucially, they're about timely decision making. And the leader's role is to give the intent, what it is we're trying to do here, and then not, as is so often assumed when we talk about leadership, the leader's job is not to provide the solution, initially at least. The leader's job is to ask appropriate questions on a constant basis in order to address the problem. Ask the various members of the team, how do you see this problem? What would you do in order to solve this part of it? How would that affect people in other parts of the team, other parts of the organization? It's a constant process of asking questions in order to address the problem and using the team to find a solution. And the timely piece is really important. We may be having a session today to try and solve a problem, but we don't need to have a decision, let's say, until June. So we can have 2 or 3 hours today. We can finish by me saying, okay, that's great. I'm going to go away, pull together some of those ideas. Let's meet again next week and we'll have another follow-on conversation. And we might do that 2 or 3 times. On the other hand, I may be saying to you, guys, we've got to make a decision by 5 o'clock tonight, because if we don't, certain things are going to follow. So we have to have this conversation. I have to ask the questions. We need to draw out the issues. But at some point, the leader's job is to say, okay, I'm sorry, that's enough. We're going to have to make a decision and move on. And this is what I think we're now going to go and do, and give the solution that we've reached at that point to everybody, so they can go out and crack on doing whatever it is that they are part of that solution. So that timely decision making, leadership not providing the answer, but talking with people, opening up question, opening up debate, that's the role of the leader in a wicked problem. And then finally, next slide, Aidan, there are critical problems, problems which go beyond tame and wicked. Now, these don't happen very often. In fact, as I said earlier, most of our day-to-day work involves tame problems. As leaders, we're simply releasing people to get on and do the things that they've always done. Wicked problems appear from time to time, but critical problems, hopefully, are pretty rare. But they're beyond tame and wicked, and they're often portrayed as an evident crisis that's general, provides general uncertainty. There's no time for discussion. There's no time for dissent or worrying about procedures or processes. Coercion is necessary for public safety or for public good. So if I was doing this for real in a classroom, I'd say, for example, I've just noticed at the back of this room, there's a waste paper bin that's on fire. I'm not about to ask questions or talk about what we may or may not do. What I'm going to tell people is, get out of this room now, and everybody will react to that. And that public safety is the driver for me being able to take, as the leader, to make a command decision. So the leader's role is therefore to take command and provide the answer, not to engage management processes or to ask questions in order to ensure that the required decisive action is put into place immediately. This has only happened to me a couple of times. I'm going to talk about some of my operational deployments in some of the follow-on talks, but in Kosovo at one point, I had to make a decision very quickly for various reasons. I had no time to discuss it with anybody. There was no time for sort of putting in place various procedures or processes. I just had to give an answer there and then. And then having done that, having made that decision and given it, we then followed up with all sorts of different things. But that was one of a rare number of times that I've had to do that. So tame, wicked, and critical problems. And as you go through your thought processes as you're listening to this, you might like to reflect on what that looks like for you. Now, next slide is a blank, Aidan. Obviously, having said all of this, none of this is easy, and there's much more I could say about it all. But what I've tried to do is to draw a baseline, and I want to now move on to what effectively is the heart of this session, and that's how, as we as Christians, put all of this into practice. And I'm going to do that by establishing what I reckon are some key timeless principles drawn from the example of Jesus himself. So first, next slide, Aidan. First is remember that God so loved the world that he didn't send a committee. He sent an accountable leader. And as leaders, we're personally accountable for the outcome of the common purpose that I referred to earlier. The buck stops with us, the leader. Jesus accepted responsibility for both his actions and the actions of the world. He was and is fully accountable. So with adequate decision-making and organizational structures, we can delegate, we can put somebody else in charge of various aspects of our mission, but we can never slope shoulders on our accountability as leader. You may or may not remember when Colonel H. Jones was killed at Goose Green in 1982 in the Falklands campaign. I don't know whether you've heard of a guy called Major Chris Keeble, but he was the battalion's second in command, and suddenly he found himself in charge in the middle of the battle. And amidst the chaos, the company commanders looked at him for leadership, and he opened up a conversation, listened to their perspectives of the situation and what they felt needed to happen. But Chris, in this situation, then moved off alone, and I've heard him talking about this. It's a very inspiring story. He moves off alone, he kneels in the burning heather, and with a prayer taken from his pocket in his hand, he seeks the Lord's guidance. And from there, he gathers himself up and he tells his command team that he is to go and to seek the Argentinian surrender. It was an extremely surprising move and very bold. But Chris is a Christian, and it wasn't by chance that he carried God's word and a prayer with him, nor that he was prepared to live with the consequences of his decision. Great leaders assume responsibility along with authority and make themselves accountable, and they don't attempt to pass the buck if things go pear-shaped. So that's the first principle. You can't lead by committee. The buck stops with you, the leader. Next slide, Aidan. Next, leaders deal with people, not stuff, going back to my earlier points. Everyone who works alongside us in our teams is a unique and magical human being with gifts to be developed and nurtured. And as I said earlier, unlike things that are finite and measurable, time, money, and so on, people's potential is infinite. And the leader's job, our job as leader, is to develop and release that potential. To do that, we need to get to know people properly, and that takes time and commitment. And in Jesus, we see a leader who did that in spades, preparing and training his small team for what was to come. Leadership is all about commitment to a relatively small number of people. The span of command within the military is usually around 10 for good reason. And Jesus' team, of course, was just 12 strong. And we know that one of them was a failure. But he concentrated on them for 3 years. They began as spectators to his ministry. Then he allows them to have minor roles before sending them out as sheep amongst wolves on small, practical missions. Initially, he goes with them. Then they go alone. And finally, having prepared and trained them for what was to come, he hands over the reins and steps away. We just had Ascension Day a couple of days ago. It's a wonderful example of leadership, training disciples to train disciples. As Spurgeon said, to convert a soul is to draw water from a fountain, but to train a soul winner is to dig a well from which thousands may drink to eternal life. So the second principle is that leadership is all about people, not stuff and numbers. Recognize that everyone who works alongside you has God-given gifts that need to be developed and nurtured. And your job as leader is to identify those gifts and give them the space and the freedom to grow. And I should add, and this is the really hard part, you must allow some of your people, those appropriate people, to surpass you in their abilities, to see others as better than ourselves. That isn't easy to do, for envy and malice, but above all, insecurity will constrain us if we allow it to. But do it we must if we are to develop and release the leadership potential in those around us and working in our teams. And that leads us on to my third principle, the next slide, Aidan, which is about servant leadership. Jesus, of course, came first and foremost to serve. He was the servant king. And if we aspire to great leadership, then we must learn to serve both God and those we have the privilege to lead, in that order. Jesus served the lost and the lonely. He served those who served the cause, washing the feet of his disciples, his command team, just hours before he went to his death, knowing that one of those whose feet he was washing would betray him. In pulling together his best-selling book, on the next slide, Aidan, I refer to this. It's a book called Good to Great. Some of you may have seen it, read it. It's an excellent book, and it's well worth a read if you haven't done so. A guy called Jim Collins and his team looked at companies who moved from being not just good organizations, but organizations that became great, and how those great organizations sometimes stumble and fall. Now, these were businessmen, a bunch of hardened business analysts, and analyzing the data that they gathered, the biggest lesson that Collins talks about learning is that success is largely a matter of choice and discipline, not about circumstances. And the key conclusion was that the leaders of great organizations are ambitious, first and foremost, for the people and for the cause, not for themselves. What Collins calls a level 5 leader displays a blend of personal humility and professional will, which has nothing to do with style or charisma or what so often drives today's world, personality. This humility that he talks about is not softness. It's about a deep desire to serve the people, to serve the company. Great leaders don't cling to positions of authority or title or status or shoulder power. They live with and through the lives of their people. It's not about me, the leader. It's about you and them, the team, those whom we are leading. The biblical word servant means under rower, someone who sits at the very bottom of the ship, with all that means in a Roman war galley. Being such a servant is certainly not an attribute encouraged by our secular society. And to be one, you must be absolutely secure in who you are. Jesus was a servant, but he certainly wasn't a doormat. He was rather, I think, a man of tremendous physical and moral courage, confident in his authority and in his place in the great scheme of things. But the simple truth is that if we are to be that secure, then the first heart and mind that we have to win in leadership terms is our own heart and mind. Next slide, Aidan, if you would, please. Sometime between 500 and 300 BC, Sun Tzu, in his book, The Art of War, which again is another great read, Sun Tzu wrote, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." And at around the same sort of time, Lao Tzu wrote, "He who knows others is strong. He who knows himself is invincible." And then on the next slide, there's a quote that I put together as a result of being involved in the first Gulf campaign. 2,000 years later, in 1991, General Franks, the commander of 7 US Corps in that Gulf campaign back in 1990-91. General Frank was the corps commander, and that corps included 1st UK Armored Division, in which I was serving. And I went with the boss of the division, General Rupert Smith, to a briefing with General Franks, and I scribbled down what he was talking about. And he said this: as we prepare to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, he said that commanders must observe themselves, learn from themselves, and gain valuable insights into themselves. For an understanding of who you are and what you are made of is essential. So, next slide, Aidan, please. I think an enduring principle is that all leadership starts with ourselves. Now, there's another lecture I can give on understanding who we are. What does that look like? And we haven't got time to go into that today. You can pick some of it up in questions if you want to. But if we're going to lead men and women in the battle of life, then we must first learn how to lead ourselves, understand our own strengths and our own weaknesses, and acknowledge the reality of that, and understand what makes us tick in body, mind, and spirit. But secure in the knowledge that we are loved and accepted by our Creator, and that we get our security in Him, not through earthly success, that allows us to control and lead others from a very safe and secure place. The prayer of the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, which is where our young people go to become officers in the British Army, that prayer says this: Almighty God, whose Son, Jesus Christ, the Lord of all life, came not to be served, but to serve, help us to be masters of ourselves, that we may be servants of others, and teach us to serve, to lead. And the hat badge of the Royal Military Academy says exactly that. It's inscribed with the words, serve, to lead. Hence my third principle of leadership, which is serve, to lead. Next one, Aidan, please. The next slide talks about the fourth issue, which is communicating with our people. Don't stand aloof from the guys in your teams, the people that you have the privilege to lead. Win hearts and minds, walk the job, meet and greet. Jesus didn't operate from an office, and neither should we. We must let our people know what is needed of them, not just at the top, but at the bottom as well, because they are the ones who complete the work, do the task, produce the goods. So spend time with people and let them know what is going on. I think this is really difficult in today's world, when we all sit in front of a screen on a desk and get tied down with IT and all the rest of it. We need to spend time with people. We need to meet everybody in our teams face to face and brief them. And as we go back into the world hopefully post-COVID, we need to bring the reality of that back into play. Brief our people on who's coming, who's going, on the policies, where are we going as a business, how are we doing in our tasks and so forth, and on progress, how are we getting on? And spend time to get and listen to feedback, which obviously often means spending time just quietly with people, listening to what it is they have to say, as opposed to just telling them what we think we want them to get on with. And remember to, rather like that issue of solving wicked problems, consultation is not compromise. But also remember that advisors advise and leaders decide. So we talk, we listen, we consult. And then as leaders, we make the decision, and we have to have the courage to stick with it. Now, not many decisions please everyone. And that often applies to decisions that we are called upon to pass on, having received those decisions from above. The next slide talks about the fact that in addition to self-leadership, there are three other dimensions of leadership. There's obviously the downwards business to those that we lead, but there's also sideways leadership to those around us who we have no authority over, but we need to work with in the various ways that we do in our various teams and so on. But crucially, there's also upwards leadership to those above us, being able to go and talk to our bosses with confidence, telling them how we feel, not just about what we think about what it is we're trying to do and so on. But as leaders, we have to have the integrity to accept decisions from above and support them, or resign. Leaders do not go to their teams and say, they up there have decided to do this. I don't like it much, but I suppose we better get on with it. What they say is, we have decided that we are going to do this and we now must get on with it. And if they can't pass that on that way, then they have no option but to resign. One of the hardest things about being a leader is not passing on what we agree with, but what we disagree with. And the bottom line is, you can't have a salary and a round of applause. Next slide, please, Aidan. And don't issue fancy directives. Speak in language that people understand. Jesus walked miles to where the people were. He spoke in words they understood. He told them stories about donkeys and sowing seeds and vineyards, and from them they learned of love and neighborliness and the kingdom of God. One of the problems today is that life is just too complicated. Our hearts are no different, though, than they were 2,000 years ago. Everyone has a simple soul, and we all need to understand what we're about. And in communicating, always tell the truth. Don't falsely protect people. Give them the brutal facts that it'll be rough, but in doing so, offer hope. Jesus told the disciples that they would be going to Jerusalem, that they would desert him, that he would be arrested and beaten up, and that he would be crucified. But he told them too that it would be okay. Churchill spoke of blood and sweat and tears, but he promised it would be okay in the end. And King George VI, on Christmas Day in 1939, the beginning of the war, said to the nation, I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be better than a light and safer than a known way. So the fourth principle is to communicate truth, and in doing so, inspire hope. Finally, and on our next slide, Aidan, please. Finally, good leaders adhere to core values. They display a willingness to challenge and change everything except core values. They keep an absolute and clear distinction between what we stand for, which will never change, and how we do things, which never stops changing. Establishing and holding firm to enduring principles, they constantly adapt the practice to meet the constantly changing environment. One of the other key findings of Jim Collins's work was that great organizations have a purpose, a reason for being that goes far beyond just making money and being successful. They ask themselves what would be lost if their business were to disappear, and therefore why they must endure, why they must continue the struggle. And that purpose goes well beyond shareholder value, stock return, corporate growth, or whatever. It rests on core values that will never be compromised. The heart of leadership are words that I touched on earlier. Leadership involves integrity and courage, holding true to our beliefs and practicing what we preach, having the courage, particularly the moral courage, to take the tough decisions, being firm and fair and consistent, taking the heat in the kitchen, accepting responsibility, and being accountable when it all goes wrong. Good leaders display the moral courage that enables them to coolly risk their career, their happiness, perhaps their whole future on a judgment of what they think is right and worthwhile. They display the moral courage to stand against the tide of opinion, the courage to do what is right, even when it's unpopular or goes against the system or the accepted norms. And we're going to come back to this in one of the later talks, in fact, I think the next talk. Now, such moral courage is deeply embedded in character, and both of these form the basis of a powerful self-leadership, enabling us to assert that there is such a thing as right and wrong, to expose wrong and teach truth, to confront evil and sin in the world, in this fallen world in which we operate. When we walk away from wrong, we demean ourselves as well as those we lead. We need to recognize it, deal with it, especially the abuse of power. So confront evil and sin and do so head on. Don't condone wrong, recognize it and deal with it, especially the abuse, as I say, and misuse of power. Assert that there is such a thing as truth, and that truth is true, even if no one believes it, just as lies are lies, even if everyone believes them. Exposing wrong and teaching truth shows those that we have the privilege to lead that they matter to us, that they are better than they think they are. But in doing so, note that Jesus, of course, condemned the sin, but not the sinner. He dealt with the sin in order to set the sinner free. So forgive failure and love those you serve for all of their faults. The secular approach is to condemn people who fail and dismiss them. The Christian approach is to recognize that people fail. We all do. It may be difficult to forgive, but never forget that as Christians, we too have been forgiven. And sometimes discipline is necessary, but we can do that, and we can have the discipline, but in doing so, make sure that people know that we care for them and the reason that we're doing that. In simple terms, love is the fifth principle of Christian leadership. Learn to live with failure, and in doing so, inspire hope. Now, these are not principles. The next slide, the final slide, Aidan, is a blank. These are not principles that the world will teach us, but the pages of the Bible will. Those pages contain the words of life in all its fullness and the very essence of leadership. And there's no better teacher than Jesus. His example of sacrifice, service, and love, developing the gifts of others, leading by winning hearts and minds, confronting evil and wrong, forgiving failure, provide the timeless principles of leadership that separate us as Christian leaders out from the rest. Now, in all of this, you may be a little uncertain. It's tough, it's not easy. And you may be uncertain of what it is that you have got to offer. Don't be. Just develop the leadership gifts that you have. And remember that the innkeeper who couldn't give first-class 5-star accommodation to a mother and an expectant mother and her baby gave what he had. He gave a stable. And from that stable, the light of the world was born. All we can do is take the gifts that God has given us and have the determination and the desire to explore them, expand them, and grow as leaders. And using those Christian principles that I've talked about, hopefully that will be the case for all of us. Okay, that's my 40 minutes. And I'm very happy to take questions, as Aidan said earlier on. And I'm not in a hurry to get away either. I know many of you will have a job to go back to, but I'm not got anything on till 3 o'clock. So if anybody wants to stay on beyond 2, then that's fine. Okay, and back to you, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was absolutely fantastic. Lots of principles for us to be thinking about. Some people probably want to just pause for some thought, but as we've only got around 10 minutes, as Tim said, feel free to stay on afterwards if you have further questions. We will formally end this session in about 10 minutes. Now, questions, please put them into Slido. If you're on the phone and can't see the chat, the Slido event code is 706181. That's 706181. Okay, so I can see 3 questions in the Slido chat. Feel free to like questions in Slido as well, because I will ask them in order of likes. So the more liked questions will be asked first. So the first question, Tim, is how can you give us some practical steps or tips to build self-awareness?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And as I said, I think in the script, there's a whole lecture in this. I think the first thing to say is we have to recognize the need for this. I mean, I've worked with many people, and I'm sure many of the guys listening to this will work with people who are just not self-aware of themselves, and they don't want to be, because being determined to find out more about who we are is a dangerous place to go sometimes. And we can only do that by delving deeply into that. So in very simple terms, we're recognizing that we're all part of our genetics. We all carry the baggage, if you like, of our genetics. So, who am I is partly where I came from, in my parents, my family, my siblings, and so on and so forth. That's what I call the hardware of life. Alongside that is the software. It's where we were educated, where we grew up, our friends, and how we how we learned about life, if you like. And that's what I call the software of life. And I would argue that the software, like an IT system, the software can be rewritten. Indeed, some of the hardware can be replaced, I would argue, as a Christian. But understanding that and recognizing that they both have a part to play, exploring both of those things. And then I would argue that, again, part of who I am, and I think the crucial part of who I am, is not just that hardware and software, not just the DNA and the environment in which I was raised, the nature-nurture argument that people talk about, but there is this spiritual bridge as Christians that we have that enables us to find out more about ourselves in a different perspective, really. So I would argue making the time to go away and attend, for example, a leadership course. Now, I quoted the leadership definition, which is the definition from the Leadership Trust, which I've actually been communicating with today. They run a leadership course, which is one of the best that I've ever attended. It's 5 days. It takes you through a whole series of processes to understand better how we react to events, how people see us, and all sorts of aspects to it. I would recommend reading about this stuff. There are some excellent books about leadership we can read. And I would strongly recommend getting a mentor, a friend, a workplace friend or a colleague who we can trust, who we can sit down with on a fairly regular basis and say, let's just talk about how I'm leading, where I'm getting this wrong, what you've seen in me that I should think about and pray about to improve. So very practically, read about this, be determined to do something about it, get a mentor, and get yourself on some sort of leadership development course that enables you to explore some of this stuff. Now, again, I can come back to this later, but that's in broad terms. I hope that helps.
Great, thanks, Tim. The next question is really a comment, but I'll read it out for the sake of feedback, as it's only short. I am a Christian leader and have not heard a pure and simple teaching on leadership like this before. Bless you, sir.
That's kind.
The next question is, how countercultural is it for some leaders to serve, and what challenges are there to change them so that they become servants? Are there any examples of this happening?
Well, I think it is countercultural. I think most of what we see around us, I mean, people will make their own views, their own judgments about where they're working, particularly obviously in the government departments that people are working in, listening to this. But as we look around us, what is driving most people? Now, I don't want to be unfair to this. There are lots of people who are perfectly happy in their work world, not striving ambitiously to get promoted or all this other stuff. But generally speaking, the world's attitude to us in terms of success is the jobs we do, the level of appointments we have, the level of rank, if you like, that we've reached. And for the world's approach tends to be that you need to be ambitious. You need to search for success in earthly terms, either through money or through appointments and so forth in work. What I think, the Christianity brings us, challenges us to be, is to recognize that, as I said in the talk, that's not where our security, and that's not how the Lord sees our success. What he sees is us as individual people who have certain gifts and talents and skills. And again, there's a long conversation about the distinction between those things, but taking our gifts, our talents and skills, and putting them to best use in order to serve what God wants us to do. Let me give you a biblical example, which is one I often use. Joshua, as he's about to lead the Israeli army into the promised land, if you read in Joshua chapter 5, I think it is, he meets a man dressed in armor. And Joshua's on his own prior to this battle. And I've been there. I can imagine Joshua prior to the battle of Jericho. That's going to be the first battle in this campaign. He's on his own, and I'm sure he's asking himself the questions: are we going to win this? Am I going to be successful? Will I be brave? What can be the consequences, and so on? And he meets this man dressed in armor, and he asks him a very sensible question. He says to this man, are you with us or are you with them? And the Bible tells us that the man doesn't give him a very helpful answer. He says no, or neither, depending upon the translation. But as the commander of the Lord's army, I have now come. And Joshua, we're told, interestingly, takes off his sandals, falls on his feet and says, what are my Lord's commands? He then receives the battle plan to take Jericho. which, if you look at it dispassionately, is the most ridiculous battle plan that a military commander could possibly have come up with. March around this city 7 days over seven times, blow some trumpets, the walls will fall down, it'll be fine. And Joshua must have thought, this is crazy. So he has a decision to make. Is he going to do what the Lord is telling him? Is he going to serve the Lord, or is he going to do his own thing? Is he going to plow his own furrow? And we know that he does what the Lord tells him. And as most of us learned at Sunday school, the walls come tumbling down. But my point is that Joshua at that point has a decision to make. Am I going to try and do this under my own strength, my own power, my own skills, and so forth? Or am I going to serve and do what it is the Lord is telling me to do? And we know what happens. He goes and wins the battle and secures the promised land. So this, that is not an earthly secular approach. That is recognizing that we are not the commanders of our lives as leaders. We serve a different God, a different leader, if you like, and that is very countercultural. And it does mean that quite often people will find us difficult or strange, or find some of the decisions we make bizarre. But having the courage to stick with them and press on is what we're called to do. I could give you lots of other biblical examples, but it is absolutely right that we need to be countercultural. Now, who out there is being countercultural opens up a whole range of issues. I mean, I think if we look into politics, if we look into economics, if we look into the military world and into the world that you're operating in, I think, to be absolutely honest, I would simply ask people to look around you and look at those people who are leading and how they're leading and what ultimately is driving them. And I'd like to think that there will be some that you will look at and think, actually, this guy, this lady is coming from a different perspective than most of the people around me.
Thank you, Tim. I said we'd finish in around 10 minutes. I can see the clock is now 13:54. So I think it's right that we should bring this webinar to a formal close. However, if you'd like to stay on a bit longer, everyone who's on, if you don't have another meeting to come to go to at 2 o'clock, then do feel free to do so. But thank you very much for coming. I will send a link to the recording to those who have signed up via Eventbrite. If you haven't done that, then I guess you could contact the Christians in Government Administrator at info@christiansingovernment.org.uk. You can find that email on the website. Thank you very much.